right now we might say it's likely, because that would mean 5 more years of this battle against multilateral institutions, and that will have a very different effect.
Well, I think one more question. When you say he's trying to mold the multilateral agencies, like actually to have American, to further strengthen American domination, or basically exceptionalism, do you think he's just trying to modify them, or it's complete rejection?
No, he sees them as a tool of power. In other words, it's no commitment to the value of these institutions in of themselves, or there's no commitment to saying that you should not push them to the point of break, or that there's some value in having them. It's essentially that if the IMF is useful in enforcing something on China or Argentina or Pakistan, for instance, then he will use it. But he actually no longer actually believes in the value of an institution like IMF for the world order. What he really believes in is that America should pursue its interest to the maximum, with no regard for anybody else's interest, and it does not have to compromise, and it does not have to sort of think about the world as a community. It has to think about the world as a jungle, and then it has to operate in that jungle.
Maleeha, you said there is a general disenchantment with the multilateral agencies. It's not just America is trying to completely doing something else, but among the other countries too. So what do you think, how can those institutions be reformed, particularly United Nations, for example? Was the most prominent manifestation of Second World, after the post-World War order. So there is certainly this kind of concern about how it is being dominated by certain countries, and there has been move to reform the United Nations as well, but it's not been successful. Do you think it can be done?
I think, Zahid, the paradox that we're confronted with today is that international cooperation is needed more than ever, because we live in an interconnected world where one issue doesn't just affect one country, it affects all of us, whether it's climate change or it's armed conflicts or unresolved disputes, you can go on and on, or trade issues. We need international cooperation, and yet the paradox is that it is under stress and it's being challenged. And at the popular level, because that was the main spirit of your question, at the popular level, obviously, people see these multilateral institutions and see them being used as tools, as Vali also said. That also leads to disenchantment and disillusionment. And I think one point I would just add to what Vali said, of course, the United States has always believed in some form, maybe it's an exaggeration to say always, but most of the time it believed in a form of a la carte multilateralism. The term has been used by somebody, I think, correctly. So in other words, you pick and choose whatever suits you, but you don't really show any concern for the others because they have interests too. That's what multilateralism is all about, that you have some concern for the other in addition to pursuing your own objective. I mean, we're all in the multilateral process because we are pursuing our own objectives, but within the context where we are also looking at the objectives of others and therefore trying to see how we can align these. So the popular disenchantment is really directed at this fact that the multilateral institutions remain constituted in a manner that's undemocratic in the sense of reflecting the kind of power distribution we see in the world today. I mean, the P5, for example, who control the Security Council, the permanent five. I mean, if you go through the list, the question that arises is, why these five? Why not have more elected members, for example? I mean, you talk about Security Council reform. I don't know how much the audience knows. Pakistan has been one of the leading countries in advocating and being very engaged at the UN in reform of the Security Council based on the democratic principles of our age. In other words, you democratize the Security Council by adding more elected members. That way you dilute the power of the P5, and you are also trying to create a more inclusive, a more accountable, and a more transparent council. I don't know how many of you know Pakistan has served 7 times as a non-permanent member of the Security Council. And each time that we have served there, we've always said, open it up, make it more accountable, answer to the questions that are raised in the public mind. And we're not the only ones. Most if not all non-permanent members, call for greater openness and greater democracy. So, returning to your question, if we are able to see some kind of reform, and we can reform the structures of these multilateral institutions, and I'm only mentioning Security Council because it is the key. It is the premier body that is charged with the maintenance of international peace and security. It is supposed to resolve disputes that exist in the world, whether they are festering disputes like Jammu and Kashmir or Palestine. But this is the body that would need to be reformed, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many other countries as well, to make it respond to the needs and the dynamics of the 21st century. The 21st century is not about just 5 countries wielding a veto. To cite one example, Soleimani's assassination, which you all know about, was not even discussed in the Council. It had very, very serious consequences for our region, for the world. It didn't even come on the agenda. What happened was that the Iranians and the United States wrote letters to the President of the Security Council, but it wasn't discussed because one country, I don't need to name that country, didn't want it discussed, one permanent member, along with its allies. So, when the public, this is just an example, the example that hits home here in our country is, of course, the fact that, for over 70 years, Jammu and Kashmir has been on the agenda of the Security Council and it remains unimplemented, the resolutions. So, Palestine. And, the list goes on and on. So, I think unless we see the Council being reformed and we see other multilateral institutions as well, not just this, but the IMF, the World Bank, they still reflect the post-Second World War order. And that order has changed. We're not living in a world where we have to just respond to the victors of the Second World War. It's been a long time.
That's right.
And next year at the United Nations, they will be discussing some of these issues. In fact, not even next year, later this year, because it will be 75 years since the creation of the United Nations. And I think some of these questions are going to come up in the public mind as well, which is, okay, so 75 years on, we know that you have made progress in many areas. And I think it's important, and I'll end on this note, it's important to also recall, what has multilateralism really delivered to the world? I think that's an important question too. It has delivered in many areas. In many areas it has not delivered, it has fallen short. So where has it delivered? It has led to the articulation of international law. It has led to the setting of standards for human rights, unevenly implemented, but at least the standards were set by agreement. It has led to the reduction of poverty. It has led to expanding social and economic progress for many people. So there are many advantages that all countries have benefited from, which is why most countries, if not the overwhelming majority of countries, still believe in multilateralism. 2 years ago at the UN General Assembly, every time at the UN General Assembly, there's always one star. There's one leader who captures the imagination of the audience and the people. So I won't name the leader because then there'll be problems. But the one leader who everybody sort of got up and applauded 2 years ago, or maybe it was 3 years ago, don't hold me to that, was a leader who stood up and spoke about multilateralism and implicitly challenged Trump's unilateral policies. The response from all continents was amazing. Africa, Latin America, Europe, you name it, Asia. Everyone sort of said, so, in a way, he reflected the desires of most countries represented at the UN.
Well, you're right, actually, it has also created some kind of, support for multilateralism. Like, for example, the United Nations Alliance for Multilateralism was created with Germany and France actually sponsored that. But there were about 50 countries signatory to that. So how powerful that group be, number one. Number two, the other thing, despite it may be a reaction to Trump's unilateralism, but on the other hand, can this alliance can also, produce some kind of reforms in the multilateral agencies, or just actually
I think you're already witnessing a kind of maybe backlash would be too strong a word, but certainly a reaction to unilateral policies being implemented or adopted by many big countries. So there is a reaction. However, we have to see whether that reaction translates into a kind of an organized move to put multilateralism back on the rails, but in a manner that it's fit for purpose for the 21st century. I keep returning to that because that's important. We can't just revive what was, historically there. I think what we need is democratization, a more egalitarian system, and a reflection of the distribution of power, of global power in the world. As I said, there's no single country in the world. No single country in the world. I mean, this may surprise people in our country, but there's no single country in the world that can achieve an outcome on its own without the cooperation of others. Even if it's the cooperation which is of an ad hoc nature and not through alliances, no country can. They cannot achieve, they cannot go to war and achieve an outcome. We've seen that in Afghanistan. They were never able to win in Afghanistan despite all the money and the military force that they applied there. So, I mean, that's just one example. But in other ways too. And then the rejection of certain unilateral policies, for example, the United States asking Britain and others to not use a certain Chinese communication network. And Europe, many European countries, Germany, Britain, saying no. So, we are in a world which is, fluid, but it does need, I'll end on this and hand over to the next question you want to ask, Aya. We do need international cooperation. We cannot do without it. The problems at the global level are just too big and too important, and they affect too many people for us to simply give it up. So I think the important thing is not to throw the baby out of the bathwater, if I can use that expression, but to see how best we can make multilateralism work for everyone, and not just for 4 or 5 countries.
Kaya, Turkey has also emerged actually as a very strong a country and contending for leadership, particularly with the Middle East crisis getting worse. Where does Turkey stand today on all those issues, number one? Number two is also the area, the region, which is in complete disarray?
Well, first of all, the crisis at the Security Council that you described has been, of course, something that Erdogan used very successfully. And he started this campaign called The World is Bigger Than 5. And he presented Turkey as the defender of these lost causes, Palestine, Egypt, and now the murder of Khashoggi. So these things, the more crisis there is in the Security Council, the more power he will get from that crisis. And second of all, Turkey had a major foreign policy shift during the Prime Minister of Ahmet Davutoğlu, a scholar, a professor of international relations, who changed Turkey's axis from West, NATO, EU, to what he calls a pivot state, from a wing state to a pivot state. So over the last decade, Turkey remade its relations with the Middle East and its neighbors, and it started to upset NATO and the US and the European Union. And suddenly our new friends became China, Russia, and Iran. And because of this shift in the foreign policy, lots of the things that Islamists have been talking about have changed as well. What I've been talking in the beginning about fighting this Leviathan through the help of European Union, all these institutions, these international institutions. So they said goodbye to do more incursions in Syria. It wants to have a corridor that it wants to protect. And its best friend, Russia, doesn't allow it. And Turkish foreign policy is really confused at the moment. Some people may call it sort of mastery. We are playing both sides, both Assad and Putin and our own people. But it seems like chance is playing a big role in Turkey's foreign policy at the moment, because what we call the Davutoğlu doctrine is no more there, because we had a book. When we wanted to ask what is Turkey's foreign policy, we had Ahmet Davutoğlu's book, The Strategic Depth, and we could see all these ideas developed over the decades about how Turkey shouldn't just be a NATO outpost. It should form new alliances. It has this. It was once a caliphate, and it has all this power in its culture. But now that Davutoğlu is an unwanted man in Turkey, no one is quite sure what happened to all these arguments and all these ideas. And also Erdogan spoke admiringly of Trump, because he's comparing him to Obama, which Erdogan I think believes that Obama wanted to get rid of him during the beginning of 2010s, and for him Obama is the real bad guy. And so Trump at least tells us what he thinks. He's not hiding behind a nice smile and civilized outlook, and he gives us what he really thinks. So he praised them, and I think it also, again, with the Security Council problem, it again works for his advantage. When there's a problem in the White House, when there's a problematic administration in the White House, when there's chaos in the Security Council, Erdogan can say, you need a strong leader, and in this dangerous jungle, I'm the only one who can steer Turkey to safety, and I'm the only defender of the Palestinian cause. So whenever Trump announces something as outrageous as that plan, or the Muslim ban in the US, it works to the advantage of authoritarian figures in my part of the world.
Yeah, Erdogan is not the only leader who likes Trump. There are many other admirers. So I'll take questions from the audience. So I think your questions should be short and don't make long comments.
Good luck.
And please identify your...
Good idea. Yeah, identify.
Race and religion and other things were lost. Where to find multilateralism in their region for their protection? So everybody is trying to figure out what national, what ideology would
I
they
think,
want.
fine. Can I take second question? Because, yeah, who's there?
Okay, my question is, what is actually motivating Trump? What are his core beliefs? Is it racism, white supremacy? And if that is the case, I think there can be a link between that and his disregard of multilateralism, because multilateralism doesn't really suit the white, the white cause. America first, and a white America first. I'd like Wali Nasir to please answer that.
So one more question, then I think probably.
Hi, thank you for your the question. Given that Pakistan is a smaller state than the big states that you mentioned, would your advice be that we now move also towards strongmen or authoritarianism to combat or to survive? Because as a smaller state, multilateralism, it's not getting us anywhere. So if any of the three of you could comment on that.
But didn't you try that already?
We can try it again. some would say that it didn't work so badly before. So
there has not been dearth of strongmen in Pakistan. We have seen would like to answer.
Sure. Well, you know, I know that from the outside there's a sort of a tinge of race and white privilege might be seen in his policy, but that's not the way he sees it. Racism or favoring white supremacy within the United States is a domestic political agenda. Whether he believes in it or he's using it, it's the reason why he is so entrenched. In other words, he has a core constituency that does identify with the fact that he is going to return America to where it was in the 1950s, restore the kind of supremacy the white Americans had. And mind you, that's also the way Boris Johnson appealed to many people in middle of England, that, you know, we're going to go back to where we were in the 1950s. But I think internationally speaking, he just doesn't see value in this. In other words, why are you compromising with the rest of the world on certain things when you can have your way, when you can actually force them to do things? So let's say instead of thinking about, I have to stay in the Iran nuclear deal because the credibility of the Europeans is attached to it, because generally it's a good idea, because if you come out of a deal, nobody else would sign a deal like this. If I come out of the Iran deal, how do I persuade North Korea to sign a deal? So he doesn't see sort of value in that. He basically says, I can come out of this deal, I can bully the Europeans to follow suit, I can impose sanctions on Iran, I can impose sanctions on the Europeans if they don't follow sanctions on Iran. And I can also, with North Korea, that's a whole different game, and I can bully him to the table as well. So it's a way of looking at what are your elements of power, right? And he clearly does not see cooperation as an element of power. He doesn't see value in alliances. Maybe the better way of thinking about it is alliances, building networks of alliances to getting things done. It might be a myopic view, but he just doesn't see worth in alliances. And I think that's the core way he sees it. Maybe it's come from the way he built his business as a real estate person, where everything is a zero-sum game. You either win or you lose. There's no gray area. And therefore, he sort of, there are times the Americans use these multilateral institutions to their advantage. For instance, IMF and the World Bank could be deployed in ways to put pressure or reward countries for cooperation. But that's not really, playing, along the way with everybody else. But I don't think race sort of is the motivation. It's the effect that people from the outside see. But in a way also, multilateral institutions too had a European Western tinge to them. And the breakdown is also allowing many other countries to flex their muscles where they couldn't do it within these institutions. The best case is China. I mean, essentially, the collapse of multilateral institutions is going to allow China to proliferate its own multilateral arrangements in Asia, in this region, and with Europe. And in a sense, they might see it actually as something that would reduce Western power.
Maleeha would like to comment.
What was the question?
About race. Would like to talk about strongmen?
Strongmen. No, I think if I believe in anything, authoritarianism is not the road to any kind of bright future. I think anywhere in the world, I think the consequences of authoritarianism always catch up. It may take a few years, but there can't be anything positive about it. But I do believe that there should be feminization of multilateral institutions. I think we've given men too long a chance, and I think it's time that women's voices are heard and women are represented much more in multilateral institutions. And the reason for that is not just because I'm a woman, that's one of the reasons. It's also because I think women are instinctively cooperative. I mean, I think we are, as members of families, in a way, we bring people together. We do not seek to divide. I mean, there may be notable exceptions, but generally speaking, so I do think that one of the ways in which I think multilateral institutions should be reformed is to ensure that women's voices are heard, and not just voices from governments, voices from civil society, voices from the street, voices that really matter and can change the destiny of countries. So I really, truly believe in that. Authoritarianism, no.
So what you are suggesting, Pakistan needs a strong woman.
I didn't say that, but I think, yes, I mean, if you cut out the adjective strong, yes. The rest I will sign up to. I think all the girls here will.
5 years back, Vali, I asked you a question here in the same hall, that Putin is the most famous and popular president. You told me it's a temporary phenomenon. Now, after 5 years, many strong men have come up. What do you think after you come after another 5 years? Democracy will be out of fashion then? And the last, very small question for Maleeha. You said America has lost in Afghanistan. Do you agree with American thinking that we lost because of Pakistan interference there?
That's an easy one. I'll answer that at the very outset.
First we'll take two more questions and then we'll go to panelists. Wait for Mike. Yeah. Just this lady.
Is it on? Yes. I'd like to ask.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. So, in terms of the consequences for this retreat or rejection from multilateralism, especially when it comes to the US, the UK, these historically great powers, what are those consequences, especially in light of the emergent multipolarization of the world, with the African Union and other actors rising on the road to 2050 and beyond?
So one more question. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my question is about, I guess, the dearth of multilateralism. But I want to ask about the fact that where do you think it started? Did it start at the macro level by these strong men or these bullies? Or do you think it is because at the micro level, each of us is otherizing the other one, whether it's US versus the rest of the world, whether it's Shia versus Sunni, whether it's Pakistan versus India? Each one of us thinks of the other in a certain way, and it could be that it's the reverse. And so then my second part of that question is, what can each of us do to not otherize the other?
Yeah, I think, will you go to,
The otherizing question, I think, is very crucial. In Turkey, we saw that a lot. The seculars were otherizing the Islamists, and when this came to power, they started otherizing the secularists. And with the advent of social media, we had a great social upheaval in 2013 in Istanbul called the Gezi uprising. And suddenly, people noticed that they were only listening to people who were like-minded. Like, if you followed those events on Twitter, from your friends, it was a different story, and if you were following them from the conservative part of social media, it was quite another story. And that's when I think we began to understand that this otherization is maybe here to stay, and it's also strengthened by technology. And the only thing we can do is just to stay in our group and defend it. And so, I call myself a liberal, and I always said, we should be in the middle ground, we should look at how they see the protests and look at the other view. But people always called me naive, like, you don't understand this. This is a war between the others of Turkey. So I think this is increasingly how people feel. In England, for example, maybe frustrated white males think that if we don't fight back, all these LGBTQI people will take our jobs, we'll be discriminated against, and all these fears and anxieties make people think that way. And as for liberals like us, I don't know how you define yourself, we are called maybe idiots or naives, and so we are the ones who lose it.
Wali, do you want to say?
I just want to very quickly say that we have to be not put everything under the rubric of multilateralism. Multilateralism itself goes back to the gold standard and 19th century international financial order, and fighting and difference would always be there. I mean, the core of multilateralism, what it, at least I would say, means accepting a set of rules and norms, what Maleeha referred to. So, you create institutions that had rules and rules. Like you go to in the climate agreement and you say, everybody has this amount of votes and we all agree to reduce carbon by this much, and we all agree to do this, and this is how we resolve our conflicts, and we all abide by these rules. So the first step is that a group of countries agree to accept rules and obey rules and follow rules. It's really about law. And it's not about that you like each other. Countries that hate each other can join in the same institution, provided they follow the same rules in order to solve the same problems. I mean, that's really the core of what should be a multilateral order.
I have a question, please.
May I respond to your question? I think it was Winston Churchill who once said, the US can always be relied on to do the right thing once it's exhausted all the other options. So I think that's applicable to Afghanistan. For almost 18 years, Pakistan kept cautioning the United States and kept urging the United States to find a negotiated end. It took them 18 years to get to where we were, but we welcome that now. I think the commitment to peace and to find a negotiated settlement should be welcomed. So my indirect answer to your very direct question is, I think we're cooperating for peace now, and the big challenge now is how to win the peace in Afghanistan. So I will leave it there. To Asif's question, which is a very important one, the consequences of this rejection or this weakening commitment to multilateralism, I think the consequences are all very negative, because what you will end up, we are already ending up in a world where there is much greater disorder, there is much greater instability, and as Vali and I have been making this point, and Kaya as well, this weakening commitment to rules and norms already agreed to is going to inject even more unpredictability to our world. And in fact, we're seeing leaders act in rather whimsical ways, which is also contributing to instability. So there's nothing good that's going to come out of it. So the answer has to be, a more broad-based response to these unilateral policies on the part of countries which I think are in vast majority to band together to ensure that multilateral institutions remain strong or are reformed in a manner that they are strengthened. Because I think the path to making the UN more credible and more respected in the eyes of people, especially young people across the world, is to ensure that its institutions are reformed. And reform would be the way to renewing people's faith in multilateralism more generally, and of course the UN in particular. So I really earnestly believe in that. Thank you.
Do you have time for one more question, I think?
I just have one more question, please, from Maleeha, Lodi. Right here, sorry. So even with regards to the Munich Security Conference this year, we saw such a stark kind of a difference between the worldview or the governance architecture / model that Europe has in mind or America has in mind, and America seemed completely in denial. But the interesting part is, with respect to this multilateralism or UN losing its efficacy, I happened to interview the Secretary General from the UN recently, and he completely acknowledges it. He understands that it's a problem. The question I have from you is, because you've been a part of, you worked over there, are we going to see resistance from the P5 regarding this, and how quickly or how long will it take to actually see a restructure happen?
Well, I can tell you very briefly, because we don't have time for a long answer. The process of negotiations for Security Council reform has been going on for almost 2 decades. And I'm afraid there is complete deadlock. And the deadlock is over this issue of whether there should be more permanent members, which we feel in Pakistan, and in fact, I think the Secretary General would probably agree with us, is that if you want to reinforce failure, then you add permanent members, because they're part of the problem. Part of the solution has to come from more elected members, and therefore, I think, the P5 would have to sign up to reform. Look, reform of Security Council will involve an amendment of the UN Charter, which is no different from amending our constitution or any country's constitution. So it's a very, very sober and prolonged process. But in this case, you need 193 countries, and there's certain processes that have to be followed. And yes, the P5 would have to agree to, this kind of widening or democratization of the Security Council. And I think that's the paradox. The paradox is that reform is stalled because of reform. We belong to the group of countries that want more elected seats. And then, of course, you have the G4. I don't need to name them. They're familiar to all of you, who want permanent seats for themselves. And what we say is, who are you to assign yourself permanent seats? This has to be done by election. And if you believe in elections in your country, then you should believe in elections to multilateral institutions too. You can't say this is good for us, but it's not good for international institutions. So this is going to be tough, but I think it will remain a very critical area if we have to renew faith and confidence in multilateral institutions like the United Nations.
I think it's gone. I don't know whether we have time for one more question or it's all. There are many more questions, but I think last question. Yes, come
on. My name is Nawaz, and Maleeha Sahiba. This question is for Maleeha Sahiba. Maleeha Sahiba, you. Sorry.
Well,
the question I have in my mind, it concerns you.
But somebody else can answer.
Maleeha Sahiba, you had succeeded in holding on to your ambassadorial jobs to various governments, including People's Party, PMLN, General Musharraf, PTI. Which tactic will you use to win these all, please?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
One man fly with